A few days ago, Democratic Assemblymember Joaquin Arambula was arrested on a misdemeanor child abuse charge after spanking his 7-year-old daughter before bed, before a school day. The next day, the daughter complained to a teacher that she had been spanked by her father, and apparently there was some physical evidence of the spanking, and as a result, Arambula was arrested on misdemeanor child abuse charges, and according to the Assembly member, he's been getting a lot of feedback from his constituents, including those who have come to his defense. Now, the Assembly member has said that he is welcoming parenting classes, learning other methods that don't involve physical discipline with his child. He and his wife have 3 kids, temporarily taken out of their custody while an investigation was undertaken. Then they were returned to the couple's custody. But my question for you is, when you look at spanking, whether it's a case of whether a mark is left is alleged in this case, or even spanking that doesn't leave a physical mark, what are your thoughts about the effectiveness of it? This is something that is deeply ingrained for so many people. The most recent surveys I've seen of Americans shows slight approval for physical punishment, spanking. But again, it's a highly divisive issue. You have celebrities, sports figures who've defended the spanking of kids as a necessary or at least potential option for parents in disciplining kids. I'd like to hear from you what you think about it. We're at 866-893-KPCC, the AirTalk page, kpcc.org. With me is attorney Paul Wallin, who is a firm based in Tustin. He defends those who were accused of child abuse. Mr. Wallin, thank you for being with us.
Yeah, great to be here.
What is the demarcation between legally permissible? I'm not talking about, this the opinion of whether it's good parenting or not, but legally permissible spanking of a child versus what isn't, what crosses to misdemeanor or even felony abuse.
Well, it's interesting because the standard of reasonableness have changed dramatically over the last 30 years. 30 years ago, it was reasonable and legal to swat your child with a belt, even if it left a mark, because the general gist at that time, community morals, was that was okay. But as time goes on and the new generation, it's not reasonable, for example, to spank your child with a belt. Ultimately, the court has to look at all the surrounding circumstances, and in general, it's fair to say that if you spank your child with an open hand on the bottom and it leaves a mark that goes away within 24 hours, that seems to be deemed reasonable, and you're not going to have your kids taken away for that. The problem we face is that there are so many mandatory reporters in the schools that as soon as a teacher sees a mark on a child and they believe it's caused by a parent, they have to, by law, call Child Protective Services or they can go to jail, and that's what starts the investigation, which is exactly what happened here with this assemblyman.
Mm-hmm. And so the fact that it did leave a mark, does that then leave him the potential of being prosecuted for the misdemeanor child abuse charge?
It does make it possible, but in my opinion, it's much more likely this case is not going to be filed from what I have read, in that it appears that his conduct in disciplining the child with an open hand and not any other object seems reasonable, even if it leaves a mark. But of course, it also depends on the underlying circumstances. A parent is not allowed to strike a child out of anger, no matter what. If a parent is disciplining a child because that child normally knows what the discipline is going to be and gets that discipline, that could make it more reasonable. And that is why I think, from what I read in the article so far, it's probably not going to be filed. They're going to go to counseling, parenting classes, and it will likely not be filed.
We're talking with attorney Paul Wallin. His firm is based in Tustin, Wallin and Klarich. Again, I'd like to hear your thoughts about spanking. Do you think it is an acceptable method of discipline for a child? What do you think are the limits on it? Do you think the law has it right or not? 866-893-KPCC. Also with us from USC, Assistant Professor of Social Work, Elizabeth Kim. Professor, good to have you with us.
Hi, good to be here.
I know that there seems to be, from pediatricians to social workers, a consensus that spanking is always harmful. What is the research that leads to that conclusion?
Right. So there's been a lot of debate, even in research, regarding the effect of spanking. But the recent research that was released, conducted by Drs. Gershoff and Grogan-Kaler, speak to the kind of spanking that does not include hitting with an object, so hitting with an open hand. And even that kind of spanking, research has shown that that's associated with more aggression, more antisocial behaviors, externalizing, internalizing problems, mental health problems, negative relationship with parents. I mean, a whole slew of negative outcomes, and also related to negative adult outcomes in terms of mental health and antisocial behavior. It's also related to lower moral internalization, cognitive ability, and lower self-esteem. And I think the biggest risk here is that spanking alone has these risk factors, but then it's also that spanking could potentially lead to physical abuse. That's much more than just one swat on the butt.
I'm wondering in these studies, I mean, one of the challenges when we've talked about this over the years is the studies disentangling the fact that spanking may be more prevalent in families where there is generally more of a history of violence, more stress within the household. So how you disentangle the spanking itself from all the other social factors that are coming into play, how do you do that in a study?
So the way that we do it in research is you could control for the level of those risk factors or the stress levels, and that's been done before. And we've also research has also looked at differences across race and ethnic groups, but it's pretty clear that there's a consensus around. Depending, even if you control for race or the stress level, the negative effect of spanking is there. It's consistent across race and ethnic groups. It's consistent across, and especially, actually, one of the studies have shown that in those contexts with families with higher stress level, the effect of spanking is actually more negative than groups that don't have that kind of stress.
All right. I'd love to hear from listeners. What do you think? And do you think that research should be blanketly applied by parents, or do you think that it's a case-by-case basis? What's your view of spanking? Is it ever appropriate in disciplining a child? 866-893-KPCC or the AirTalk page, kpcc.org. Let's talk with Kelsey in San Pedro. You're on AirTalk.
Hi, my name's Kelsey. I am 28 years old. My mom was a fan of the wooden spoon and the belt. I was a pretty quick learner. If I were to ever step out of line or say something that was uncouth or uncourteous or something that warranted a spanking, I learned pretty quickly. I only had to make the same mistake once, or maybe only had to make a mistake once in order to learn that I would get the wooden spoon or get the belt. I mean, my mom by no means, abused me with it.
Kelsey, let me ask you then, if you have kids, I don't know if you do now or if you're intending to in the future, but would you be leery of using physical discipline because of what the studies show about it, or would you take the positive experience you're describing with your mother spanking you and apply that to your kids?
To be frank, I think I don't have children. Hopefully someday I will. I think it honestly depends on the temperament of my child, because my younger brother was quite the opposite from me, and he was not as fast of a learner as I was, and he got the wooden spoon a lot more than I did. But I'm actually grateful for the fact that my mom utilized that as a tool in her arsenal, because timeout was whatever. We would get soap in our mouths, but I learned which brand soap, I liked, instant.
Okay, so this got your attention. Kelsey, thank you so much. We'll continue our conversation as whenever we pick up this topic and discuss it, we have a wide range of opinions about whether it's ever appropriate, whether it's ever beneficial to use physical discipline with a child, or whether that should be completely off the table for use. 866-893-KPCC. We'll be back in 1 minute.
Hi, it's Nick Roman. There was no shortage of important, complex news in 2018, and KPCC and NPR were there, bringing you the reporting, analysis, and conversations that help make sense of it all. There'll be a lot of important stories to cover in 2019, too. So now's the time to stand up and show your support. Donate now to power all the engaging stories and valuable journalism you'll rely on. Make your year-end tax-deductible gift now at kpcc.org. And thanks.
KPCC supporters include Marine Mammal Care Center Los Angeles, the county's only year-round hospital for seals and California sea lions. Their family-friendly holiday donation drive is Saturday, December 15th from 11 to 4 at the hospital in San Pedro. The public is welcome to donate items from the wish list posted on their website. Proceeds directly benefit seals and sea lions. The event will feature live music, gift shopping, and viewing of sea lions. Parking is open to all. More info at marinemammalcare.org.
You're listening to AirTalk on 89.3 KPCC. I'm Larry Mantle. We're talking about the case of a Central Valley State Assembly member who was arrested last weekend for misdemeanor child abuse. As we've heard from our attorney expert, Paul Wallin of Tustin in Orange County, he thinks it's doubtful the charges will actually be filed, but that the assemblyman has already agreed that he'll take parenting classes, that he and his wife will go through a process to avoid using physical discipline with any of their 3 children. But the response he's gotten from constituents, he says, has included many who've supported him in this. My question for you is, do you think spanking ever is a positive approach in discipline usage in child rearing or not? If you're someone who was spanked as a child, what effect do you think it had, and how might that affect whether you use it or whether you have used it with your own kids? Ben in Tustin, I understand that you were spanked as a child and that you've also, as a parent, you've spanked your child. So what are your experiences on both ends of that, so to speak?
Yeah, well, it's the biggest mistake that a parent can ever make. I was spanked once only by my mother when I was about 7 years old, and it is one of the most impactful memories I have of my mother and of my childhood. I carried that resentment with me for many years, possibly for my whole life. And then, unfortunately, when I had a child, my wife and I both spanked him once when he was around 3 or 4 years of age, and he immediately learned that that was an appropriate response. And within a few days, he was hitting out at my wife and me, and then his young sister later on. So we taught him a very bad lesson, and I learned a very bad lesson from my mother.
Why do you think that her doing that once left such an imprint on you?
I think it's very hard for us as parents to understand the impact that things can have on children. And, something like that can be so traumatic, so shocking to the psyche of a child that it can override so many other memories. And sadly, in life, negative memories so often crowd out positive memories. I have several negative memories of my mother, who was a wonderful woman. I love her to bits. I'm so grateful for everything she did for me. But those few negative incidents have crowded out so many hundreds of wonderful positive images and messages and memories.
Ben, I appreciate your call. Thank you for describing it both as a parent and when you were a child. Now, Dana and Redlands had different experience of this. Spanking was definitely effective on me. It happened once. That's all it took. My husband, on the other hand, remembers laughing when his mom spanked him and telling her that doesn't hurt. I now have an 18-month-old son, wouldn't be against spanking, but wouldn't do it until he's at least 3 years old, when he can actually understand the consequences of his actions. Hopefully he takes after me and not my husband. Elizabeth Kim, USC, a professor of social social work. Your thoughts on Dana as well as our caller?
It's interesting because spanking is really prevalent in the United States. Two-thirds, it ranges from 65% to 85% of children reporting that they've been spanked before. And people endorse spanking. In 2016, 66% of women said they think that children need spanking. 76% of men said children need spanking. It's very prevalent, but the research is very clear that even though it might seem to have effective in terms of immediate compliance, it's actually pretty harmful in the long run.
Although we know that's not universal because we have listeners who say it was a positive experience for them. We have no reason to doubt that that's the case because they would know best. So we're in a study, of course, we're talking about on average, not individual response.
Right.
Let me share some other listeners. Well, let's talk Nancy in Pasadena. Nancy, you spank your kids. I understand you have 3 of them. So what are the terms under which you use spanking?
Our kids are now teenagers, so we no longer spank them. But we did from about 18 months until about 10 years old. We spanked for 2 reasons, for disrespect and disobedience. We spanked from 1 to 3 times, depending on the severity of what they had done. And then we would take time to comfort them and restore them back to the family without the sense of judgment. The incident was done, and they understood that there are consequences for their actions. And that's what I find is very effective about spanking, is that long before kids have developed rational skills, they can associate cause and effect.
All right. And what are your teenagers, have they ever talked with you about their perceptions of it now?
Yes, we've talked to them about it. They didn't see anything wrong with it. They actually understood that it was part of the training process for them. They're very well-behaved, well-spoken,
all right,
be respectful people. They're not resentful. They're not traumatized. And
all right. Nancy, I appreciate it. I'm so sorry. I want to get other points of view in. Sergio in Ventura said, I think it's absurd. People are overreacting to spanking. Obviously, it's not abusing a kid. At some point, kids don't listen. You have to do things to get their attention. It's not the first approach I take, but sometimes it works. That's Sergio. Rebecca in Silver Lake says, I was spanked as a child. I work in restorative justice now. It's clear that spanking impacts children in a negative way. Rebecca says, there's scientific studies showing it's harmful. We should call it hitting. Aaron in Santa Monica said, I grew up as the oldest of 5 kids in a fundamental minister's house. Spanking was done with a belt or paddle. We were told it was done out of love. It was abhorrent. It's a cycle of abuse. It just builds confusion and resentment. That's Aaron in Santa Monica. Elizabeth in Glendale says, I'm a mandated reporter, a teacher, and I think spanking is detrimental to development. Julio in Downey says, it's case by case. I'm perfectly fine with spanking when the child warrants it. I have 2 daughters. One needs spankings, the other doesn't. Mostly a symbol at this point. My wife and I never spank her hard. You can share your comments on the AirTalk page, kpcc.org, as it continues to be a highly divisive issue among parents. My thanks to our guests, Elizabeth Kim, USC professor, and Paul Wallin, attorney who represents those accused of child abuse.